A handful of soil pulled from the central Amazon comes up black, not brown, not the exhausted red clay of the jungle floor around it, black like ash, like something burned and buried 1,000 years ago, and then somehow kept alive underneath. The rainforest, for all its green, grows on some of the poorest dirt on Earth. Strip the canopy and the ground beneath turns sterile within a few seasons. The warm rain drives the nutrients straight down and away. Nothing there is built to last. Nothing there is supposed to hold. And yet, in scattered patches across the basin, there is earth so rich that local farmers still dig it out and sell it by the truckload, centuries after the hands that made it disappeared. They call it Terra, Preta, Portuguese for black earth. Nobody living planted it. Nobody, as far as the record will admit, quite knows how to reproduce it from scratch. It keeps its fertility while the soil beside it dies in 5 years, and the people who work it will tell you, quietly, that the black layer sometimes seems to deepen on its own. So the question is plain: who taught this ground to stay alive? The mainstream answer is not a shrug anymore, and I want to be fair to it, because it is genuinely good science. Terra Preta is anthropogenic, human-made. Archaeologists now agree it is the residue of pre-Columbian settlement, built up over generations from charcoal, pottery shards, bones, ash, and household waste worked into the ground. The charcoal is the key. Burned at low oxygen, wood becomes what scientists call biochar, a porous carbon skeleton that holds nutrients and water and shelters microbial life for astonishing lengths of time. Add the phosphorus from bone, the calcium from shell, the slow biology of a lived-in place, and you get soil that feeds itself. This is documented, replicated, real. So the consensus is settled on the how, more or less. Ancient Amazonians, over hundreds of years, accidentally, and then perhaps deliberately, engineered the most fertile soil in one of the least fertile places on the planet. It is a triumph of indigenous knowledge. Most researchers will tell you the mystery is essentially solved. And here is where I have to slow down. Because there is a detail the tidy version steps around. When the first Europeans came up the Amazon, they described something the later record insists could not have been there. In 1542, the Spaniard Francisco de Orellana became the first to navigate the river's full length, and his chronicler, the Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, wrote down what they saw. Carvajal described continuous settlement, villages running for miles along the banks, farmland, roads, populous towns, so many people that the expedition feared for its life. For 4 centuries afterward, historians treated this account as a lie. There were no cities in the Amazon. The friar had exaggerated, hallucinated, invented to please his patrons. The jungle was empty, and always had been. That was the settled position well into the 20th century. The Amazon was a counterfeit paradise, too poor in soil to have ever fed large populations. Carvajal was dismissed as a fabulist. The problem is that the counterfeit paradise sits on top of Terra Preta, soil engineered specifically to feed large populations. The empty jungle turned out to be full. Sit with that reversal for a moment. The soil was called impossible, then real. The cities were called impossible, then real. LiDAR surveys and Amazonian archaeology now reveal earthworks, causeways, and settlement geometries stretching across regions long mapped as untouched wilderness. Twice, the official record insisted nothing was there. Twice, the ground disagreed. And here is the crack the tidy story cannot quite close. If Terra Preta was built over centuries by continuous, deliberate management, if it required a living population tending it, adding to it, keeping the biology alive, then what happened to the recipe? A knowledge that dents does not simply evaporate. Someone should have carried it forward. The consensus answer is grim and probably true. The people who knew died. Old world disease moved up the rivers faster than the Europeans themselves, and it is now widely estimated that epidemics erased the great majority of Amazonia's population within roughly a century of contact, before most of those societies were ever described. The gardeners were gone before the world knew they existed. I want to be honest that this explanation is sufficient. You do not need a hidden hand to lose a technology when you lose 90% of the people who held it inside 2 or 3 generations. Knowledge lives in hands and seasons and spoken instruction, not in books. Catastrophe is a complete answer. It may simply be the answer. But watch what happens next, because this is where one reading of the story turns colder. The forest closed over the fields. The survivors were pushed into smaller, mobile bands. The very primitive Amazonians, later anthropologists, would study and declare incapable of building anything. The emptiness became the evidence. The absence was read as proof there had never been presence, and the black earth kept its silence beneath it all. Consider what Terra Preta actually is, if you strip the science down to its function. It is a food system that does not depend on outside inputs. No imported fertilizer, no purchased amendment, no external authority. Build it once, tend it, and the ground provides. It is, in the most literal sense, sovereignty made of soil. That is why the pattern, when you widen the lens, starts to feel less like simple forgetting. The loss of Terra Preta was not one event, it repeats. The knowledge vanishes with the epidemics. The record then denies the knowledge ever existed. And when self-provisioning indigenous food systems reappear elsewhere in the Americas, again and again they are undone, not by disease this time, but by policy. This is the part people mean when they speak of a food system that was, in effect, made illegal. And here the documentation is real, so let me stay strictly on it. In the United States, the deliberate destruction of the bison in the 19th century was understood at the time as a way to break the Plains nations by removing their food supply, recorded in the words of officers and legislators of the era. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke communal indigenous land into individual plots and transferred the surplus away, dismantling collective food economies by statute. Later, boarding schools severed children from the people who carried planting and gathering knowledge. None of this is fringe history. It is in the law books and the archives, plainly written. So the theory, and I want to mark clearly that this is where evidence hands off to interpretation, is not that one villain buried a super soil. It is quieter and, if true, more unsettling. It is that self-sufficient food, land that feeds people without dependence on the market or the state, has been treated, across very different regimes, as a thing to be dismantled, which raises the hardest question in this whole affair. How do you get that kind of consistency? The Spanish crown, the disease itself, 19th century American generals, 20th century land bureaucrats, modern agricultural science. These are not allies. They did not meet. They often despised one another. Coordination on this scale, across these centuries, is not plausible, and I will not claim it. But coordination may not be required. This is the coordination problem at the heart of the theory, and its most interesting move is that it doesn't need a conspirator. Every one of those institutions separately had the same interest. Populations that feed themselves are populations that cannot easily be taxed, moved, converted, or controlled. Self-sufficiency is inconvenient to power in the same way, regardless of who holds it. You do not need a meeting when everyone's incentives point the same direction. Disease clears the land. The empire calls it empty. The science of a later century inherits the empty map and builds on it. The policy of yet another century finds self-provisioning peoples in the way and removes the provision. No architect, just a current, and everything heavy drifting the same way downstream. That is the theory's strongest claim, stated as fairly as I can. A silence does not have to be organized to be total. It only has to be in everyone's quiet interest not to break it. And Terra Preta, the soil that needed no one's permission to be fertile, sits under all of it. Proof of a way of feeding people that the last 5 centuries never quite found a use for. I owe you the counter-argument because it is strong. Nothing here requires suppression. Knowledge was lost to plague, not censorship. The Amazon was misjudged out of ignorance and bad soil science, later corrected by the same establishment now championing Terra Preta. Hardly the behavior of a system hiding it. The land policies were about conquest and greed, not a coherent war on self-sufficiency. Each piece has an ordinary explanation. And I think, most days, the ordinary explanations are probably right. That is the honest position. What the theory offers is not proof they are wrong, but a discomfort with how neatly they line up, how a dozen unrelated forces, none of them coordinating, all happened to push toward the same outcome. People who once fed themselves from engineered ground and no longer can, and a recipe no one can fully rebuild, because that last fact remains, underneath every reasonable objection. We can describe Terra Preta. We can list its ingredients: charcoal, bone, pottery, waste, time. We have made soils that resemble it, but no one has reproduced the real thing, the self-renewing 1,000-year black earth from a standing start. We have the parts. We have lost the sentence they were spoken in. None of what I've laid out is settled. It is a reading, one possible shape pressed onto facts that are individually true and collectively ambiguous. The soil is real, the lost cities are real, the plagues and the laws are real. The line connecting them into intent is mine, or the theories, and you are free to cut it wherever your own judgment says it stretches too thin. I only ask you to hold 2 things at once: that the black earth exists, feeding the ground 1,000 years after its makers were erased, and that we, with our laboratories and our satellites and our patents, cannot quite make it, and have built, in more places than one, a world where a soil that asks no permission would not be permitted to spread. Somewhere in the Amazon, right now, a farmer is cutting into a bank of earth that is darker than it has any right to be, selling it off by the sackful, planting into what remains. The layer, they say, will come back. No one has explained how. And that is the door, standing open in the dirt, leading down into a way of living we apparently decided we could live without.